Okay, so it's just reached 4 o'clock. I'll make a start now. So thank you for everybody who's joining this flash briefing today. So I do plan on talking about cyber incident response as part of our Navigate Cyber Safety campaign that's ongoing within the organisation. So I'll move on to the next one. So who are we? So IT governance has been around for around 15 years. Around about 200 employees. We're basically a one-stop shop to cyber security and privacy management. And we look at a whole host of services across spectrum to our customers. So just on the size of IT governance, risk management, solutions, more than 12,000 clients across 6 continents. And more than 4,000 training solutions delivered to date. So we do work, in terms of IT governance, we do work across the UK, EU and US. And we are part of the broader group, the GRC International Group, which is a range of companies that you can see on the diagram on the right-hand side. So introduction. So basically, who am I? So my name is Cliff Martin. I'm currently the cyber incident response within IT governance. I new to the organisation. Prior to joining IT governance, I used to work in defence and the education sector. Specifically around cyber security. So this is something. So before we get into the content, just a couple of reminders. Some housekeeping. So you will be muted for the duration of the session. If you do have any questions, please put them into the chat function. And at the end, I will try to answer the many questions. At the end of the presentation as well, a copy of the presentation and the recordings for this session. They will also be put onto YouTube at some point in the near future as well, so you can share that to friends if you choose to. So what we're going to talk about in this flash briefing. So first of all, so what is cyber incident response and why should you? The stages of cyber incident response. We're going to use an example of the JBS Ransomware attack, specifically looking at our evil aspects of what we do from organization, what you can do to better prepare yourselves for forward. And then the fourth one there is become cyber incident ready, be able to protect, detect, and respond to a cyber incident if you actually happen. So move on then. So why should you care about cyber incident response? I'm sure everybody on who's attending this briefing will all agree with me when I say that cyber security, cyber attacks are becoming more the norm, and it's very unlikely that you'll see something on the news with relation to something related to cybersecurity. So on the screen now, there's a number of references, quotes that are taken from recent publications. So the first one is the FireEye M-Trends report for this year. As you will see, for the EU, the number of days that an attacker can be on the network, on an organisation, the rest happens network, is increased from 54 days to 66 days last year. So that's 66 days when an attacker is on your network, doing whatever they choose to do, depending on what their goal is. Obviously, if we're talking in terms of ransomware, 66 days is a very long time for them to prepare and get your organisation ready. The next one is a quote from the UK government cybersecurity breach survey, which was again last year. That's 46% of businesses reported that they had a cyber breach within the last 12 months. That's nearly half of all UK businesses that admitted that they had a cyber incident. Remember, not everybody admits they have a cyber attack. So as I'm sure you'll all agree, cyber incident response is key when it comes to protecting your organisation. because those days, those hours really mean quite a lot when it comes to protecting and responding to a cyber incident. The next one, so 44% of UK consumers claim they'll stop spending with the business temporarily after a security breach, and then 41% claim that they'll never return to business. So imagine if you suffered a cyber attack and 44% of your customers all said that they would stop buying from you as a customer, and that could have a significant impact on businesses. I'm sure you'll all agree. And the last one there, so organisations spend around £2.9 million recovering from the cyber incident, and that was from the IBM cost of cybersecurity data breach report, again from last year, which is a significant amount of money. But if you think about it, in terms of incident response and all the sort of activities that you do as part of that, it makes sense, just depending on how quickly you respond to a cyber incident and all the people within the organisation have to get involved. So moving on, this is a slide just to highlight some of the headlines that have been released over the last couple of years. The majority of these are recent. But this is not something you need in your organisation. You don't want to be associated. Suffer the cyber breach, to pay out so much money, handle the it's not the place you would like to be. I'm sure you're all it's becoming the norm. So I'll move to the next one. So what is cyber incident response? And this is a quote from the ISO 27035, which is specifically around cyber incident management. So actions taken to mitigate or resolve an information security incident, including those to take to protect and restore operational conditions of an information system and information stored in it. So basically, this is how an organisation protects, detects, and responds to a cyber incident. So moving on to the next bit. So the stages of cyber incident, and why is this important? So the cyber incident response process, so depending on the standards and the sort of things that your organisation does, the approach and the terminology might change depending on what standards you're using. So this is an example of ISO 2005 where it talks about these stages, but if you were to use the likes of NIST or CREST or any other standards for that matter, the terminology might be slightly different, but it follows a general similar pattern. So you have a suspected cyber incident on the left. The first stage is obviously the detection and reporting. So you first have to identify that you've had an incident and what the full scope of that is. Because if you're unable to understand what's being compromised, how can you respond to that cyber incident? Yeah, and part of that, depending on the type of organisation, if you're dealing with like personal information, for example, you've got over reporting requirements, 72 hours in the case of GDPR, but you've got to report that to the ICO, and that's the same across various different standards, regulations that you might be associated with as well. So the next stage is the assessment and decision as well. So this is where you will contain and assess the cyber incident and the artifacts associated with that. So this is where you might conduct a forensic investigation to determine the root cause, and whether you really understand the full scope of that investigation, or whether there is something else that you need to do. As one of the quotes before, it talks about an attacker might be on a network for up to 66 days on average. That varies. But if you're unable to detect that they're actually there, then you're never going to fully respond to a cyber incident. Then it comes the response. So this is the eradication and recovery of the organisation and the IT system that's been affected. When we talk about recovery, it's key that we test the the assets that have been compromised prior to providing them back into operation, because what you don't want is to have a compromised asset where you've not fully mitigated the issue, and then you restore it back to operation, and then your organisation is compromised again very quickly, which then you've got to go back and go back to the detection and reporting stage just because you potentially missed something. So it's key that you have a recovery procedure when restoring assets back into operation. And then after that, so one of the questions we need to ask is, has the incident been resolved? If so, if you've been through testing, you believe you've covered the full incident, then you can move on to the lessons learned. So this is the aspects where you look at what you did over the course of that incident, and then you first try to understand, make sure you have covered everything, but then any lessons that have been learned through that exercise, experience is then fed back into your plan and repair. And this is where you will look at things like your cyber incident response policy, your cyber incident response plan, for example, and anything else that you may need. We'll talk a little bit about playbooks very shortly as well, which looks at specific risks associated with organisations and the sort of things that you can put into them. And then hopefully, if everything's went well, we can close the incident. So moving on, so if we start talking, so that was a very high level for science and responses. So I'm sure everybody on the call is aware that JBS at the beginning of June declared that they had a cyber incident. Significantly how they worked as an international meet. Now, it turns out the incident was actually at the end of May, so it's the final week, but then JBS themselves began public at the beginning of June to inform she was when closed an operation for a short time. Now, JBS themselves managed to restore their services, or majority of their services, without paying the ransom. There was a couple of assets that, or databases, I believe, that they did need encryption keys for because they were able to restore from backups, but the majority of their operations they were able to restore in the end. Now, JBS, as you may be aware, they decided to actually pay the ransom, or they decided to pay $11 million in ransom. Now, that was a significant reduction in what was originally asked, which was $22.5 million. Sorry. Now, they had managed to negotiate that price down from the original, and they agreed to pay that. And the main driver for that was that they wanted to ensure that they protected their customers' data. They wanted to ensure that their customers was protected. So that's why they chose the decision to pay rather than just carry on and ignore it. So when it comes to ransomware, I know we've had a briefing before about ransomware, but when in terms of ransomware, it's a lot easier to recognize. Obviously, the attacker has their goal in mind is to make money. The cyber criminals is there to cause a lack of availability for your IT infrastructure. So it includes encryption of files and potentially ransomware as well, as we're all aware now, with the intention of getting some money from the organisation, which recently comes in Bitcoin, but will change in the future. So in terms of response, an organisation should have a plan in place. Now, that could be a playbook where you're looking specifically at ransomware and saying, right, if we are attacked by ransomware, this is the steps that we will take. And that should include the decision whether the organisation is going to pay on it and what that actually means for the organisation. Now, in terms of JBS, they took the decision because based on the risks associated that they would pay the ransomware, they believe that it would cost less to pay the ransom rather than the other issues that would come as a result of that attack. Now, an organisation needs to understand what the looks like. Outside of ransomware, any cyber attack, you need to understand what your assets are. What's critical to your organization? What does the wrong look like? Because if you don't know that, how are you ever going to discover what abnormal is? And that is key when we're talking about cyber incident response and resiliency. So just to finish off this slide, so the conclusion is never recommended to pay ransom. So that's a given, but that's not always the case for all organizations, because some organizations just don't have a choice. You know, they, for whatever reason, you know, backups, there is a high risk of customer data, you know, everything like that. It does come down to the organization, and this is why it's crucial that you determine that before an incident happens as part of your cyber incident response capability. So just moving on to this. So as I said, some organizations just don't have a choice to pay your ransom. But this is an interesting quote that was in Newsweek last week. A study surveyed security professionals around the world. 80% of businesses that paid after a ransom attack suffered a second attack. Those hit the second time, 46 believe the same group as the attack. Now, who said there's no honor and fees? You know, you pay a significant amount of money, but then you've shown that you're willing to make this payment. So why wouldn't you attack it again? You know, they're obviously there to make money. They're not honest criminals. And then just further on, in the same article, it said that 25% of organizations hit by a ransom attack were forced to close. Now, that is really disappointing. You know, as a result of a cyber incident, an organization has to close shop. You know, there are things that you can do before you get to that position, which not everybody does, obviously. Okay, so looking specifically at the RE ransomware, and this was the group that was behind the JBS attack. Now, RE themselves have been around, the ransomware family has been around since April 2019. But I'm sure everybody will agree, they've been very successful. Now, the RE ransomware, it's a ransomware as a service, so it is provided to cyber criminals as a service, which once it gives you something to focus on, it's down to the people who buy that ransomware, depending on how they're going to compromise that network in the first place, which makes it really difficult for defenders. And some of the research that was done by Sophos, they actually said that no two criminal groups that deployed the ransomware actually did it the same way, which makes it really difficult. So I can't stand up here and say, well, you should be doing X, Y, Z, and this is the sort of thing you should be looking for, because it varies. So I and any other cybersecurity professional can only make recommendations based on what is happening in terms of the landscape. So if we just go through the life cycle of an example of the attack. So the first stage is obviously recon of the victim's organization. So this is where they're trying to understand what they're trying to attack. So this will include looking on Google, for example, or there is specific websites like Showdown and Census, which if you've got any internet-facing assets, might show up on their database, which will show exactly where the vulnerabilities exist, which includes things like ports and services, which gives people a database of exactly where they need to look. And as a defender, we need to be ensuring that we have locked down our internet services, service-based equipment. So the next stage is, once they've done the recon, they need to gain initial access, and this can be done in various different ways. Now, what the examples of RE, they've shown that they'll attempt to brute force their way into your network, which includes things like trying to brute force their way into RDP, your desktop protocol, VPNs, your cloud infrastructure, for example. You know, there may also be instances where your email address and password has actually been part of a previous breach, and the RE group will take benefit of that, and they will just take your information and use that or try it as part of their brute forcing effort, and fingers crossed for them, they manage to use it. Now that's why cyber professionals will always recommend you don't use the same username and password across multiple services. The next one is credential harvesting and privilege escalation. So once they're in, they need to be able to move laterally through your network. And this gives a defender the time to be able to discover that somebody, they must be doing something. So what does abnormal look like? What we see, not potentially with this group, but with Conti, for example, they were targeting organizations, but they would try to access infrastructure out of hours, for example, where it's less likely that somebody would be monitoring them. It's just one thing to be aware of. And then internal discovery. So as we look at ransomware, there's a lot to ransomware before we actually deploy it. They need to be able to discover the hosts that they're going to compromise. You know, does those hosts, are they compatible with their ransomware? Do they have the right privileges to be able to deploy the software or malware against ransomware? Now, what we are starting to see, and became more of the norm last year, was around this double extortion. So ransomware groups, to force their victims to pay, they will actually steal large amounts of data from their organization, so that if an organization says, we're okay, we've got backups, we don't care what we do, the ransomware group will actually turn around and say, well, that's fine, I have all this sensitive information, which includes personal information, and we're just going to paste it into the public domain. And that's where organizations might be more tempted to pay the ransom because of the risk of that information being made public. You know, take JBS, for example, they paid $11 million to protect their customer data. Then we move on to the ransomware. So the ransomware is deployed. In terms of our, we do also have a blog, which is the little picture to the right there as well, where if they do compromise a victim's infrastructure, they will post on their blog another mechanism to try and get, or try to force that organization to pay the ransom. And then in terms of the ransomware group, you know, the ransom is paid or not in the case of. So that's just a very high level, quick go through the RE ransomware group, the sort of things that they do, the sort of things that you should be looking for as defenders. So become a cyber incident ready. And there's a number of considerations on this page, this slide. I'm not going to go through each of them, but one thing I've got to say, it's not so silver bullet to cybersecurity. It's all around having a risk cybersecurity, and that very depending on the organization. It's key that you understand the assets. What does normal look like? Because if you don't know that, assets are on the network. Somebody plugs something in, somebody enables certain services, or software gets installed on. And another one that I just want to focus on is you need to have a plan. You know, when it comes to cyber incident response, it's no good trying to come up with it on the spot, because it's just not going to work. You're going to miss things, and it's going to cost you far more than it should when you're trying to respond to that incident. So having a plan up front is good practice. It should be. You should have that plan. Sorry, I just didn't check. Another thing there is staff should be trained. You know, people in your organisation, be it general awareness of your staff, but also the organisation themselves and the cyber incident response team should be trained. They should be skilled to do what they need to do. They should have the authority to make those key decisions when it comes to cyber incident response. You don't want to be in the middle of an incident and then all of a sudden you need to get authority from somebody who's on holiday to close down the network, for example, whilst you try to investigate. You know, it's never going to work. So the quote at the bottom, basically, 66% of businesses that were assessed have very uncomprehensive cyber incident response plans, and we don't include the detail that we really need there. So practical steps that you can take now. So obviously we're a cybersecurity consultancy. We offer a range of services around cyber incident response and the sort of things that we can do. You know, if your organisation does have cyber incident response capabilities, then we can come in, we can have a look, we can do a readiness assessment. We can also help the majority of organisations. It's not a case of if, it's a case of when. We are that cliche that you've probably heard time and time again. So these are some of the services that we provide. Also related to that is our penetration testing. So trying to understand where your vulnerabilities exist within your infrastructure is key as well. So being able to manage those vulnerabilities associated with your organization. So if any of this sounds good, just want to get in touch with us. Here is our contact details. Please have a look at the services. We do provide a lot more. This presentation. Just have a look. Get in touch with us if you have issues, concerns, questions. Thank you very much. Apologies, I've just seen a couple of messages on the chat which says that the sound quality is terrible. So listen to the, if you have any questions, please reach out to us. Any of our services, just so what I'll do, there has been a couple of questions that have come through, so I'll read them out and then answer them if I can. If a cyber incident response team fails to recognise or respond correctly, will they be punished, or does it depend on exactly what happens? Now, it does depend. You know, if you're unable to recognise and respond correctly to a cyber incident, how do you really know that you've managed to mitigate and respond and get the attacker off your network? If you can't do that, then you're always going to be chasing your tail and then constantly in that cyber incident response loop where you're going back, you're identifying, you're assessing, you're containing. You're never going to get out of it. It's just going to cost the organisation to be able to do that. You know? And then it also depends on whether you have cyber insurance, for example, that might have an impact on your organisation if you've been able to manage that incident. Hopefully that answers the question. The next one, so if a cyber incident response team fails to recognize, sorry, I've just answered that one. Do we have any more questions? Sorry, I'll just mention that again. So if a cyber incident response team fails to recognize or respond correctly, it does depend, but it could cost you significantly reputation and money to what you're trying to achieve. Sorry, lost the words then. Is there any other questions? No, don't think so. So just one thing. So in terms of standards and regulations, is there anything I'd recommend? In terms of the organisation, it depends. So I mentioned a couple there. So there was NIST and there was ISO 27035, sorry. Sorry, yeah, so if you are using ISO 27001, there is a cyber incident response part of that you can use. If not, there is NIST, which is freely available, and there's also the CREST framework as well, which is useful as well. So if you do need any help, please reach out. We can help. Sorry, May, I've not seen any questions in the registration. I will have a look and see if I can get back to you on those, if I can answer them. So we are approaching 30:30. I'm very sorry about the sound quality. Not sure what's happened. If you do have any questions, please reach out to us and try to answer. And I'll try and dig out those questions and get back to you. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully it wasn't too painful with the sound. Thank you.